For it is only by re-examining the economic underpinnings of the Third Reich, by focusing on questions of land, food and labor, that we can fully get to grips with the breathtaking process of cumulative radicalization that found its most extraordinary manifestation in the Holocaust. Part of the goal of this video is to demystify some of the economic aspects of Germany in this period, a topic which is often taken for granted in popular history narratives. In many popular conceptions, particularly those fronted by people on the libertarian end of the political spectrum, Nazi Germany represents a special and aberrant example of what happens when a state seizes absolute control over all aspects of the economy. This sort of conception could not be further from reality. In the historiography of Nazi Germany, the Sonderweg thesis is a conception of Germany's history that regards its undemocratic development as markedly different from the rest of Western Europe, that Germany took a special path contingent on developments in the 19th century. In this view, the German bourgeoisie failed to develop enough power to accomplish its historic mission of overthrowing the entrenched aristocracy and instituting a liberal parliamentary government, and the result of this was National Socialism. For sure, all past history weighs on the present moment, whatever that moment may be, and so it's undeniable that these developments had some hand in what led to the rise of Nazi Germany. But I mentioned Sonderweg because it implies a uniqueness to the German experience, an alien character, something that maybe couldn't happen elsewhere. In the words of historian Roderick Stackelberg, pitting the blame for Germany's misdevelopment on the pre-industrial aristocratic elites who should have been displaced from positions of power is really a sophisticated way of freeing the German bourgeoisie of responsibility for the unfortunate course of German history in the 20th century. Looking for some unique German characteristic as the cause for Hitler's rise may make it harder to prevent something similar from happening in a society such as ours. Some historians on the left reject Sonderweg on the basis that the theory underestimates the potential for fascism to arise within liberal capitalist societies. Should you continue to look for the alien in Nazi Germany, the imagery and narrative conjured by your mind is one of which things work differently from here, wherever or whenever that may be. And this obscures the many dark mirrors of our own society that could otherwise be seen in Nazi Germany, things that form prerequisites for the rise of Hitler. We're going to talk about the economics of Germany prior to, during, and after World War II. According to Roderick Stackelberg, Nazism is today remembered above all else as a cultural and political movement of unique destructiveness. Because neutrality towards Nazism is hardly possible, interpretation of its origins, meanings, and causes has become a battleground between competing political orientations, whether the egalitarian left, the liberal center, or the conservative right. Achieving true neutrality in the writing of history is also not a simple ordeal. Cold War historian and Yale professor John Lewis Gaddis said the following in Landscape of History, quote, "Because no two historians will ever perform this task in just the same way, there can be no single standard for objectivity in biography, or for that matter in all of history. The judgments any historian applies to the past can't help but reflect the present the historian inhabits. These will surely shift as present concerns do." Here's Roderick Stackelberg again. "History is interpretation. No historian, however, can justify his or her work solely on the basis of providing the, quote, essential facts. Writing history is not separable from interpreting it. Even the most positivist and meticulously factual approach to history cannot avoid interpretation, if only in the selection of facts deemed worthy of presenting. I belabor this point because it's vital to dispel one of the fundamental misunderstandings of history, the idea that it's somehow apolitical and without academic battlegrounds. These are battlegrounds in which the nature of a period's history is continually reshaped, ideally, to be more accurate and truthful. Adam Tooze says the following in Wages of Destruction. "But whilst we have been busy unraveling the central ideological and political thread of Hitler's regime, other crucial strands of the story have been relatively neglected. Most notably, historians have tended to downplay or even ignore the importance of the economy." The Nazis attempted to curry favor with big business, but they also attempted to curry favor with many other interest groups in Germany prior to seizing power. This is what political parties do ahead of elections, after all. But capitalists in Germany were also playing their own game, trying to make sure the tumultuous political environment in Germany at the time would see a resolution that favored them. Since the Nazis were not in power prior to 1933, their appeals to the business community of Germany were all rhetoric and distant promises. Politicians often present themselves as something they're not, in order to curry favor among voter blocs or powerful political groups such as the industrialists of Germany. Fascists at times both attempted to appeal to workers through rhetoric characteristic of socialist movements, and at the same time attempted to appeal to big business, by ensuring a return to stability and safekeeping of private property rights. And as we all know, the Nazis specifically positioned themselves as socialists of a, quote, superior type. The 25-point program of the Nazi Party represented such an effort to appeal to a broad constituency, with olive branches to the workers who would rather vote towards the left. Quoting Associate Professor of History at the Open University of Israel, Ishai Landa, Yet, fascists also said different things, uttered quite different words, which confronts the historian with difficult choices as to when precisely to take them at their word and when not to. This is not an easy task, but it's a challenge that I believe some historians have met adequately, and I'll be quoting them extensively in this video. I'll be showing the promises made by the Nazis to the industrialists of Germany and the promises they kept. Quoting Roderick Stackelberg, in 1928, Hitler did issue an explanatory codicil, assuring the Nazis' middle-class constituency and its corporate supporters that the party would respect and defend the right to private property. He was determined, however, to avoid any policy debates in the party in order to preserve his own freedom of action. This promise, however, would be kept. A year before Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, on January 27th in 1932, in the Industry Club of Dusseldorf, Hitler delivered a short speech before wealthy industrialists at the invitation of Fritz Thyssen, also a wealthy industrialist and an early supporter of the Nazi Party. In his speech, Hitler said, quote, "This entire cultural edifice is in its foundation and in its building bricks nothing but the result of the creative achievement of the intelligence, the diligence of individual people. In its greatest results, the end achievement of divinely gifted geniuses. It is hence understandable that nations of illustrious pasts gradually begin to forfeit their position of leadership once they succumb to unlimited democratic mass rule, since the existing and potential top achievements of individuals in all fields are henceforth rendered ineffective because of the oppression of the great number." Ishai Landa says this should sound familiar, for it is the standard economic liberal complaint against the smothering of individual enterprise by democratic political liberalism, the tyranny of the sterile majority overriding the liberty of the inventive minority. Landa continues in his analysis of the rest of Hitler's speech, quote, "The inherent difference in economic achievement is the only coherent basis upon which a political administration must be carried out. Capitalism cannot survive if administration of property is hijacked from the producers, the gifted individual capitalists, and transferred to the collective." Adolf Hitler continues, "To deny the authority of the personality politically and to put in its place the law of the great number of democracy, the theory of the equality of merit is by now not only political, but has already developed into an economic system. Analogous to political democracy on the economic terrain is communism." Hitler and his inner circle held another meeting on the 20th of February 1933, just 1 week before the fateful Reichstag fire, which would enable the Nazi seizure of power. The meeting took place at Hermann Göring's private villa. Hitler, now Reichskanzler, was prepared to explain his policies to 25 representatives of the German business community. Among those present were representatives of IG Farben, Krupp, Vereinigte Stahlwerke, and the Reich Industrial Association. According to Adam Tooze, Hitler explained how business was founded above all on the principle of personality and individual leadership. Democracy and liberalism led inevitably to social democracy and communism. Quoting Tooze, his audience had been left in no doubt. Germany's new chancellor planned to put an end to parliamentary democracy. He planned to crush the German left, and in the process he was more than willing to use physical force. Göring pointed out that since German business had a major stake in the struggle against the left, it should make an appropriate financial contribution. Quote, "The sacrifice would be so much easier to bear if industry realized that the election of 5th of March will surely be the last one for the next 10 years, probably even for the next 100 years. Following the speech, several of those present contributed sizable election funds to the Nazi Party. According to Adam Tooze, it was the donations in February and March 1933 that really made the difference. They provided a large cash injection at a moment when the party was severely short on funds and faced, as Göring had predicted, the last competitive election in its history. The core of Hitler's socio-economic ideology, according to Landa, is that capitalism is synonymous with high culture, communism with mass culture, that communism goes along with democracy and capitalism with an authoritarian political system. In Hitler's view, to maintain capitalism alongside democracy is a fool's errand. As Landa puts it, a pernicious illusion. One of the authors who inaugurated serious modern scholarship on the economics of Nazi Germany, Henry Ashby Turner, was also one very critical of the notion that the Nazis and capitalists of Germany were closely affiliated. Even so, Henry Ashby Turner said the following in 1987. "Observers have repeatedly alleged that Hitler abandoned the socialistic tenets of the NSDAP during his pursuit of power in order to placate big business patrons. Yet, an examination of his writings and utterances revealed that Hitler had nothing to abandon. He had never been a socialist, in the sense of favoring the state ownership of the means of production. His commitment to economic competition and private property derived not from expediency, but rather from his fanatically held social Darwinist beliefs about the nature of mankind and human society." Roderick Stackelberg notes a few factors as important to Adolf Hitler's political success, key of which, he says, was the, quote, "determination of conservative leaders to replace the Weimar system with an authoritarian regime. The fear of the growing appeal of communism to workers radicalized by the Depression produced a backlash that benefited the populist Nazis more than the elitist nationalists." Quoting Stackelberg further, Hitler's tactical decision not to spell out his economic plans in any detail also worked to his advantage, as farmers, artisans, and small proprietors, as well as the economic elites, could reasonably expect to improve their prospects under his rule. Many middle-class Germans in particular were also attracted by the prospects of a return to law and order. Hitler promised a society that would overcome class conflict and, quote, eradicate Marxism. And this was welcomed strongly by the German middle class. In the Reichstag election of July 1932, upper and middle-class voters disproportionately supported the Nazis, and many of their votes had come at the expense of drawing voters from the bourgeois center parties like the Democrats, the People's Party, and the conservative smallholder parties. It's important to note, however, that while the middle class was overrepresented in the Nazi Party and its constituency, they did manage to draw a sizable number of working-class voters to them as well. The working class was just underrepresented. The conservative businessmen of Germany sought right-wing, quote, authoritarian rule in order to protect their interests. They were either willing to stomach or enthusiastically cheering on the anti-Semitism and violence of the Nazi Party to reach that goal. Adam Tooze described the strategy of the German capitalists as, quote, a high-risk gamble, but not an unfathomable one. And in the end, for many, the gamble paid off. Quoting Adam Tooze, the meeting of 20th of February and its aftermath are the most notorious instances of the willingness of German big business to assist Hitler in establishing his dictatorial regime. The evidence cannot be dodged. Quoting Adam Tooze, by the mid-1930s, the result of this multitude of negotiations and compromises was highly satisfactory to Hitler's regime. Rather than obstructing political change as it had done in Germany's first revolution in 1918 to 1919, big business was an active partner in many key facets of Hitler's national revolution. In virtually every context, even settings in which one might have expected some resistance, the regime's political representatives found active collaborators in German business. As the Nazis seized power, society did not transform radically as the shop floor radicals of the Nazi Party had promised or hoped. The party purged the Sturmabteilung, as the conservative and economic elites who had facilitated the Nazi rise to power distrusted their radicalism. The system that the Nazis had implemented was one of the new and old existing side by side. Quote, there was no sweeping elimination of the existing framework of government. The state's administrative functions were left largely in the hands of the existing civil service. Just as industry was left in control of the capitalist elites, large-scale agriculture remained in the hands of the landed aristocracy. According to Roderick Stackelberg, quote, an organized capitalist market and private ownership of the means of production remained in place throughout the Nazi era. During the 1930s, the Great Depression spurred increased state ownership in Western capitalist countries. In Germany, after the rise of the Nazis, however, as Germa Bell puts it, they went against the mainstream. In 1932, Vereinigte Stahlwerke was bought by the state at 364% of their market value. The stated reason was to prevent foreign interests from buying up the shares. Soon after the rise of Hitler, the government's controlling stake of 52% was reduced to less than 25%. Industrialist Fritz Thyssen was a key beneficiary of Vereinigte Stahlwerke, and one of Hitler's early backers in big business circles. Vereinigte Stahlwerke, like many other German firms, were moved out of state ownership or control and into private hands, in a process we now know as privatization. This term is often attributed to the neoliberalism of the Thatcher and Reagan era of the late 1970s and early 1980s, and considered to have been coined by author Peter Drucker. Professor Germa Bell claims that the term privatization actually originated within academic works from the late 1930s and early 1940s, dedicated to analyzing the economic policy of Nazi Germany. In 1941, Maxine Yapel-Sweezy's The Structure of the Nazi Economy described Nazi privatization of the United Steelworks. Germa Bell speculates that this is the first instance of the use of the word privatization in English-language social science. Of course, Sweezy was writing in 1941, lacking the evidence and scholarship that we have today, but her description of the privatization effort is nonetheless interesting. According to Germa Bell, one of the main objectives of the policy of privatization was to stimulate the propensity to save, since a war economy required low levels of private consumption. I'm not quite sure if that's true, especially when taken against the Nazis' momentous efforts at increasing private consumption that Adam Tooze details in Wages of Destruction. This and other approaches at maximizing the potential of the war economy at the cost of the civilian economy can, however, also be interpreted as an investment in the civilian economy, as Adam Tooze also notes. He says, paraphrasing here, if one is to do justice to our collective understanding of the Third Reich, you must seek to understand it on its own terms. In this view, limiting civilian consumption aided the war economy, which aided conquests of rich countries, which then subsequently favored domestic civilian consumption. Bell continues, high levels of savings were thought to depend on inequality of wealth. which would be secured, according to Sweezy, through privatization. Quoting Sweezy, "The practical significance of the transference of government enterprises into private hands was thus that the capitalist class continued to serve as a vessel for the accumulation of income. Profit-making and the return of property into private hands, moreover, have assisted the consolidation of Nazi party power." In the end, more businesses were nationalized in the Weimar era than under the Third Reich. Although the economy was largely left in private hands, managed by the same industrialists who had managed it before, in a mutually beneficial partnership between the party and capital, there are also, of course, examples of overtly state-controlled firms. Perhaps the best example of this is the aircraft production industry. Yet again, quoting Adam Tooze, "Though all of the firms except Junkers were nominally in private ownership, they were all creatures of the Reich Air Ministry and its director, Secretary of State Erhard Milch. Fundamentally, therefore, Germany's largest new manufacturing sector was not merely state-controlled. It was a product of state initiative, state funding, and state direction. It was founded, indeed, on one of the most blatant acts of coercion applied to any non-Jewish business in the history of the Third Reich. Dr. Hugo Junkers owned the largest aircraft plant in Germany, and Göring and Milch wanted it. In October 1933, Hugo Junkers was arrested and his aircraft plant expropriated and integrated into the new rearmament plan. Every Luftwaffe firm other than Junkers remained in private hands. But even so, their expansion was dependent on government and not private investment. There are very rational economic explanations for this, however. This was a crowded market that the Nazi government was trying to rapidly expand. Firstly, this was military aircraft production. These products had little commercial value in a civilian market, which meant that unlike other sectors in the German economy, this one was entirely dependent on the flow of government orders, which could be changed at will. So, a private actor engaging in this market exposed themselves to significant financial risk, unless the government invested in their expansion, in which case the government would be assuming the risk. Note that even here, in what Adam Tooze describes as, quote, "the most dramatic industrial intervention in the Third Reich," all of the companies, except for Junkers, remained in private hands. Though the economy remained in private hands, 47% of the growth of the total national output in Germany between 1935 and 1938 was caused directly by the Reich's increased military spending. That's a very large amount. This, however, also shows how private business owners who were fulfilling these government orders benefited from the Nazi government. Across Germany in the spring of 1933, the Nazi Party and its nationalist allies carried out a wave of repression against communists, social democrats, and Germany's small Jewish minority. They co-opted the traditionally left-wing May 1st celebrations in order to orchestrate a, quote, celebration of German labor. The day after, brown shirts stormed the offices of trade unions, shattered them, and confiscated hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks of property and welfare funds. The trade unions were replaced by a parastate organization known as the German Labor Front, or Deutsche Arbeitsfront. The Labor Front wasn't a trade union. It was set up to control the shop floor radicals of the Nazi Party and to ensure, quote, labor peace. The organization was under party control, not worker control. The founding statute of the Labor Front explicitly rejected all thoughts of class conflict. This was carried into full practice as capitalists, business owners, managers, and so on were also encouraged to join the Labor Front. This was not a labor union. One aspect of the Labor Front's mission to achieve, quote, labor peace was its pseudo-welfare policies. The front ensured access to cultural and recreational programs under the slogan of, quote, strength through joy. The Labor Front worked towards ensuring housing access and luxury consumer goods access, all in an effort to placate the German worker and keep the radicals of the party in check. Quoting Tooze again, "When the wage freeze of 1933 was combined with the destruction of the trade unions and a highly permissive attitude towards business cartelization, the outlook for profits was certainly very favorable. Hitler's regime promised to free German firms to manage their own internal affairs, releasing them from the oversight of independent trade unions. In future, it seemed, wages would be determined by productivity objectives of employers, not the dictates of collective bargaining." Following the Great War, the Weimar government instituted rent controls for housing, which disincentivized private investors from constructing new apartments. The Weimar government's solution to this was to publicly subsidize construction of new housing. Despite this effort, new constructions were too expensive for working-class families to afford. With the Depression, funding for new constructions collapsed from 1.34 billion Reichsmarks at its peak in 1928 to 150 million Reichsmarks in 1932. Following Hitler's seizures of power, the Weimar system of subsidized housing construction was ended, and the early Nazi housing policy consisted of shifting construction more into the hands of private investment. Under the Weimar Republic, 42.4% of all housing finance had been provided by the public authorities. By 1936, after the rise of the Nazis, this had fallen to just 8%. The Nazis attempted to alleviate the housing issue by sponsoring a settlement program that was to bring 10 to 15 million Germans into small towns with names like Hitlerberg or Göringen. Even so, compared to the billions spent by the Weimar welfare state on housing, the Nazi settlement program's funding only amounted to 150 million Reichsmarks in total. This was to be an affair largely organized and carried out by private, enterprising individuals. An alternative scheme of people's housing was then attempted. These were modest, tiny apartments without hot running water, central heating, or bathrooms, and electricity would only be used to provide lighting. The effort at constructing these poor living spaces ended up costing enough to drive rent to 60 Reichsmarks a month. That's 20 more than the subsidized apartments in the Weimar Republic, which even then were too expensive for the working class. The People's Housing Project eventually in a sense came to fruition, but at greater cost to the Reich's coffers than anything shouldered by the Weimar Republic, due to a failed attempt at reaching a Fordist-style mass production which would lower costs of construction of these apartments and make them available to all Germans, as Ford Motors vehicles had become for many Americans. Eventually, the Reich had to resort to subsidizing rents to apartments that cost 40% more to build than the ones built under the Weimar Republic. Some YouTube quote-unquote historians like Tick History, who I've made a video about before, depict the Nazi regime as outright hostile towards German business. If so, where was the opposition to the regime? We've talked about plenty of collaboration between the regime and business, and we've talked about how businesses benefited greatly. The answer is that while some capitalists may have felt disgusted at the Nazis' actions, this disgust was not strong enough to outweigh the benefits they enjoyed under the regime. Their convictions, if any, were not strong enough to manifest into a front of resistance. Such a front existed, however, prior to and during the war, and it came largely from the left. Quoting Stackelberg, "It came almost exclusively from communists, social democrats, and left liberals, the particular targets of brutal repression in 1933 and 1934. The social democrats were hesitant to oppose Hitler's initial rise as he had come to power by constitutional means. Labor unions were also hesitant to oppose the regime and answer communist calls for a general strike, fearing repression. This repression came anyway. The left-wing hardliners, the Communist Party of Germany, never wavered in their opposition to Nazism. Following Hitler's rise, many social democrat resistance cells also operated in Germany late into the war. But what of conservative resistance? Quoting Stackelberg, "While the attitude of the left towards Nazism was one of uncompromising hostility, the attitudes of most conservative resistors to National Socialism was marked by ambivalence, and their conversion from supporter of the regime into its opponents typically came late in the war, when Germany's military prospects became bleak. Even then, according to their own testimony, they opposed the murderous excesses of the regime and its failed policies, not its fundamental military and political aims." According to Adam Tooze, there was marginal conservative opposition to the war in 1938. These men, however, were not principally opposed to Hitler's regime, nor were they opposed to the war itself. They only opposed war because they didn't think they were going to win. The sharpest impetus for regulation of the German economy and the imposition of economic planning came through Germany's rearmament effort and the need for a wartime economy. These were political concerns insofar as they were necessary to realize Hitler's ideological impetus for conquest, but because of that, they were also economic concerns. There was no ideological impetus to regulate the economy for the sake of, to place a leash on capital or to expropriate capitalists. These were all means to an end, and that end was rearmament. Rationing, protectionism, expropriation, and other measures utilized by the Nazis were not unfamiliar to the Western liberal democratic economies that Nazi Germany would find itself at war with. These are crisis measures, and war can undoubtedly be considered a crisis. Thus, the most so-called draconian measures imposed by the Nazi Party on the German economy became more and more commonplace as the country gradually accelerated towards war. In 1938, Göring's decree for securing labor for tasks of special state importance provided the Reich with the power to conscript workers, to redeploy them for any period while requiring their former employers to keep them on the payroll. Quoting Tooze, by 1939, no less than 1.3 million workers had been subject to such compulsory work orders. Quoting further, though compulsion was not the norm in relation to German workers any more than it was in the regime's dealings with German business, the possibility was now established that if rearmament demanded, the state could intervene in the working life of every single individual. In this respect as well, Hitler's regime clearly crossed a bridge in the summer of 1938. Another draconian measure which bears mentioning was that of Aryanization, the imposition of conditions on Jewish business that either caused them to go under or encouraged them to sell, paired with a wave of Nazi terror against the minority Jewish community of Germany and Austria. This, however, had very little impact on the overall makeup of the German economy. According to Tooze, only in a handful of sectors did it cause a major shift in ownership, most notably in retail, particularly in department stores, textiles, clothing, and private banking. In general, the idea that the tiny Jewish minority ever occupied a dominant position in the economy and that Aryanization could therefore constitute a major turning point in national economic life should be seen for what it always was: an absurd anti-Semitic myth. Continuing, quote, "These acts of persecution in no way improved the overall position of the German economy. Given the small scale of such businesses, the amount of labor and other resources released by these means cannot have been more than trivial. Nor should we exaggerate the fiscal benefits reaped by the Reich. Dilemmas of agriculture and the cold logic of supply and demand would be instrumental in leading Germany towards war, and towards Europe's favorite, settler colonialism." Quoting Adam Tooze, "The search for greater territory and natural resources was not the outlandish obsession of racist ideologues. These had been common European preoccupations for at least the last 200 years. Europe's vast colonial empires had largely ended the phenomenon of famine in Western Europe due to the European ability to tap into huge new sources of overseas supply. The economic shock of the First World War significantly changed this, and by 1930 virtually every German had some personal experience with, quote, prolonged and insatiable hunger. The term Lebensraum, or living space, stressed so often by Nazi leadership in its justification for atrocity and war, still was anchored in a rational economic problem facing Germany. In terms of land per farmer, Germany was comparable to, quote, backward peasant nations such as Ireland, Bulgaria, and Romania. On top of that, German farms, for the majority of German farmers, possessed under 10 hectares of land, on which the return was depressingly low, dooming them to a grind of poverty and overwork. With Germany's substantive and dense agrarian population, even if all German farmland had been redistributed through land reform, it would only have provided each of Germany's 3 million farming families with an average of 3 hectares, which would not have provided them with a standard of living comparable to the cities. The only way to both maintain the traditional rural way of life, which was integral to Nazi ideology, and elevate Germany's economic position and standard of living was to seek that land elsewhere through colonial conquest, as the rest of Europe had done. Quoting Tooze, "One might speculate, of course, about the possibilities that might have been opened up if the Third Reich had been determined enough to force through the kind of wrenching structural changes being imposed by Stalin and the Soviet Union. Of course, agrarianism was a major part of Nazi economic ideology, and as Tooze says, none of this was practical politics in the 1930s. Instead, the problems facing Germany merely confirmed the belief on the part of the Nazi agrarians, including Hitler, that the ultimate solution to Germany's problems lay in conquest in the East." In 1932, a report delivered to a secret leadership conference on the future of Eastern policy of the Third Reich outlined the future mission of the SS. Quoting Adam Tooze, "The prelude to a massive program of German settlement would therefore have to be a wholesale demographic rearrangement. Those left in place were to serve as slave labor on German settler farms. The SS was to be the sword and shield of the settler movement." On the 22nd of June 1941, the Third Reich launched not only the most massive campaign in military history, it also unleashed an equally unprecedented campaign of genocidal violence. However, in Eastern Europe, the epicenter of the Holocaust, the Judeocide was not an isolated act of murder. The German invasion of the Soviet Union is far better understood as the last great land grab in the long and bloody history of European colonialism. According to Tooze, the Judeocide in the Soviet Union was the first step towards uprooting the, quote, Bolshevik state, after which Slavs were to be removed to make room for German settler colonialism. Quote, "Complementing this long-term program of demographic engineering was a short-term strategy of exploitation, motivated by the, quote, practical need to secure the food balance of the German Großraum. The attainment of this entirely, quote, pragmatic objective required nothing less than the murder by organized famine of the entire urban population of the Western Soviet Union." End quote. The Nazis dubbed this plan of colonial resettlement and demographic engineering Generalplan Ost. It was estimated to be a grotesquely expensive affair at around an estimated 40 to 67 billion Reichsmarks, more than the combined total of all investment in the German economy from 1933 to 1938. Much of this capital was to be sourced from private investment. About 20 billion of it, more than was expected to come from the national budget. It would be expensive not merely in terms of capital, but also in terms of labor. By utilizing slave labor instead of wage labor, they expected to save an estimated 40% in cash terms. In January 1942, Heinrich Himmler said, quote, "Major economic tasks will be addressed to the concentration camps in the coming weeks." At the Wannsee conference, Reinhard Heydrich said, quote, "Under suitable command, Jews are now to be deployed for labor in the East as part of the final solution. In large labor columns under separation of the sexes, Jews capable of labor are to be led building roads into the territory, in the process of which, without doubt, a large part will drop out due to natural wastage. By this he meant many would die due to these conditions they would be subjected to." It's important to remember that while the gas chambers of Auschwitz often take center stage in our conception of the Holocaust, many were simply worked to death as the cold logic of production, market forces, and the goals of the regime still considered this amount of labor indispensable. The hunger plan, which intended to starve 31 to 45 million Soviets to death, and the Wehrmacht's well-documented and openly communicated plan to murder tens of millions in the opening phase of Barbarossa, must also be remembered alongside the gas chambers. Victims of the concentration camps, even those of the Nazis' quote, final solution, were in their ideal terms to be worked to death in order to save money, but also to remove a perceived strain on the Reich's food supply, quoting Adam Tooze. By reducing the quote, economic imperative to the question of labor, what is obscured is the no less important question of food. We are thus led to ignore what in 1941 had been an independent and powerful quote, economic imperative for mass murder. Food cut across the contradiction between economics and ideology, between the need for labor and the imperative for genocide. It provided the Third Reich with a starkly economic incentive for murder on a scale larger even than the Holocaust. It was for want of food that the Soviet prisoners of war, the concentration camp inmates, and the other Ostarbeiter died in such dreadful numbers, even after they were supposed to be deployed for the purposes of the war effort. End quote. If you watch my Tick History video, I've talked about the Ostarbeiter before, but I'll repeat it here. For the Ostarbeiter, primarily Ukrainians forced into working in Germany, it became national policy to dock the food rations of underperforming workers in order to redistribute that food to workers who were performing better. Quoting Adam Tooze. The key idea was to concentrate the available food on those workers who were providing the best return per unit of calories. Food was an investment to which the investor expected a return. Quoting again. Those falling below the norm were threatened by a fatal spiral of malnutrition and underperformance. During the Reich's foods crisis of 1942, a weapons company reported that Ukrainians, quote, willing to work were collapsing at their machines. Of course, this was conscripted labor. Their workplaces were surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. I don't think they were very willing to work. The arms company requested more food for their workers, quote, only for the purpose of getting the greatest possible performance out of Ukrainian workers who are undoubtedly diligent and usable, end quote. Quoting Tooze. It's characteristic for the state of mind in Germany at the time that the firm felt it necessary to point out that its complaint had nothing to do with sentimental humanitarianism. It had only to do with their productivity. Quote, the profit motive provided an incentive for the use of concentration camp labor. There are scant records for the profitability of forced labor in concentration camps. However, there is one complete set of records for concentration camp labor in the instance of the building of the Leubel Tunnel. Cost accounts show that concentration camp laborers were 40% less productive than that of the German laborer. These concentration camp workers and the other foreign workers were less productive, and especially when they were underfed, but Germany was in need of extra workers to carry out its armament production and the colonization efforts in the East. And even though they were less productive and you had to pay the SS, they did cost less to employ than a regular German worker. Slave labor, colonization, and the concentration camps all factored into Germany's grand economic strategy, and provided labor to private firms where there had been none. Labor that, due to its coercive nature, could be more profitable to the capitalist owner, even if the individual laborer was less productive. The businessmen of Germany benefited, and they were complicit. There just weren't enough workers, and the use of slave labor was a way to ensure a steady flow of profits. As some would say, supply and demand. Basic economics. Even the German branch of the all-American company Coca-Cola likely utilized slave labor from the East, according to records by its CEO Max Kite. There's more on that in my Coca-Cola collaborators video if you want to see that. Towards the end of the war, Nazi Germany became increasingly politicized. Quote, even prominent businessmen were no longer immune. Indeed, Heinrich Himmler and the Gestapo made a point of singling out bourgeois defeatists for especially aggressive reprisals. When I note that the economy was increasingly politicized towards the end of the war as Germany began losing, I would like to stress, as Adam Tooze does, that politicization doesn't necessarily inherently imply incompetence, and a quote, non-ideological management of the economy wouldn't necessarily have resulted in more effective management. Tooze calls it a juxtaposition between ideological commitment and practical effectiveness that continues to underpin much historical writing about the Third Reich. The men in charge of directing the German war economy were, however, deeply ideological, and while the turning point that eliminated any chance of Nazi victory came with the dual shock of America's entry into the war in 1941 and the Soviets pinning the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in 1942, the efforts of these deeply ideological men, quote, allowed the regime to survive for a remarkable 3.5 years, despite the overwhelming material superiority of its enemies. The key to this awful resilience of the Third Reich lay precisely in the alliance formed in the aftermath of Moscow between some of the most brutal exponents of Nazi ideology and the key power holders in the German economy. On June 22nd, every year Germany hands out its most highly endowed journalism prize. It's awarded in honor of the memory of, quote, the personality and life's work of the entrepreneur Dr. Herbert Quandt. The journalism prize amounts to 50,000 euros and is highly sought after. Dr. Herbert Quandt was an entrepreneur deeply involved in the Aryanization process of Nazi Germany. He utilized slave labor and maintained a network of Nazis post-war. The Quandts are owners of BMW and today some of the wealthiest people in the world. The owners of the company are descendants of Magda Goebbels, who killed herself in the fuel bunker in 1945. Quote, Magda's first husband, Günther Quandt, to whom they owe their name, was a major supplier of arms, ammunition, and batteries to the Nazi war effort, and a gigantic employer of forced labor. Magda's surname is Goebbels because her second husband was Joseph Goebbels. This is not an ad. Have you ever had a frozen pizza from the brand Dr. Oetker? Then you may be surprised to learn that the company was one of 30 German businesses to be awarded the honorary title of National Socialistic Model Company in 1937. In 1937, the Kaselovsky-Oetker family, who owned Dr. Oetker, acquired a one-third stake in Grotterjan malt beer, an Aryanized brewery. This brewery is still a major part of the family empires today. Rudolf August Oetker, who was responsible for the company's massive post-war growth, had been a volunteer Waffen-SS officer who had enthusiastically enrolled in the training course at Dachau concentration camp. Without him, your frozen pizza likely would not exist, and maybe it shouldn't. Quoting Adam Tooze, defeat was a shock, but it did not end the prosperity of this cluster of families. All of them survived the war. Their fortunes were, if not intact, then at least the basis for regrowth. Though according to Tooze, Nazi-related fortunes make up a small minority of the top 30 billionaire list for Germany, but they're still there. Quoting further, defeat was a shock, but not in the end a disaster. West Germany delivered capitalist democratic stability anchored safely within the US orbit. The price of post-war stability was some redistribution to stabilize a society crowded with refugees, homeless, and displaced persons. That shifted wealth shares. But what might have been a dramatic moment for wholesale redistribution, by way of a 50% flat rate levy on all wealth assessed in 1948, was instead commuted into a manageable tax. Wealth and privilege persist, or perhaps we should better say they are produced and reproduced, through their anchoring in law and through networks of social contacts and relationships of trust and kinship. They also persist through crafting self-protective narratives that legitimize and defend wealth. It's easy to otherize the Nazis, to view them as a phenomenon, event, and thing separate from us, something wholly alien to us and our society. Ask any reasonable person and their gut reaction would probably be to say that they were monsters, and I can't really argue with that. But if they were monsters, then they were our monsters. The Nazis as a historic phenomenon appeared within our society. They were born out of the conditions of our world. They were us. And the conditions they brought about, hellish as they were not unprecedented. The ravaging of the Soviet Union, the internment of ethnic groups, and the settler colonial project to which all of this belonged have precedents in European colonialism, as Columbia professor Adam Tooze pointed out. And, I would argue, very similar settler colonial projects are taking place at this very moment. The Nazi death machine was not entirely alien. Under any scrutiny, much of its fundamental structure is immediately familiar, as it appears in many countries. Quoting Adam Tooze, so far-reaching were the regime's interventions in the German economy that one is tempted to make comparisons with Stalin's Soviet Union. Most notably, in comparison with the Soviet Union, the Third Reich shrank from a dramatic rationalization of the most backward sectors of its society, peasant agriculture and the craft sector, a measure which might have freed millions of additional workers. If one must therefore concede that the Nazi Party, unlike the cadres of Soviet communism, was not a battle-hardened weapon of class war, by Western European standards it can hardly be faulted for its lack of redistributional energy. Never before in peacetime has a sophisticated capitalist economy been redirected so purposefully. This redirection, of course, was towards rearmament and the preparation for colonialism and genocide. When figures on YouTube and elsewhere want to portray the Nazis as a, quote, socialist phenomenon, they're not just seeking to discredit socialism. They're also seeking to separate the Nazis from our economic system in defense of this system. As Tooze said, a narrative to defend wealth. If you're incapable of seeing the Nazis as existing within a society much like our own, you're not equipped to notice Hitler too when he shows up with a slightly larger mustache. On that meeting with the industrialists in Dusseldorf on January 27, 1932, Hitler said the following, quote, The white race can maintain its position in practice only if the differences in the living standards in the world are retained. Give to our so-called export markets the same living standards that we have, and you will find that the preponderance of the white race, which is expressed not only in the political might of the nation, but also in the economic position of the individual, can no longer be retained." End quote. I'm very sorry for this coming right after the Hitler quote, but I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon. Your support means the world to me and helps me make these kinds of videos. It is a lot of work. The script was 31 pages long and carried over 100 references, meaning it's my most detailed script to date, I believe. Speaking of, I'll be posting the script for patrons to read with all its messy cut content and so on. Patrons also saw this video early and will see future videos early as well. Special thank you to the patrons at the $10 tier, Labo, Bashire, Jordan M, and Monday's Last Brain Cell. Also thank you to Bashire for correcting my pronunciation of your name. And I hope I got it right this time.